My parents devalued my home purchase. My brother joined them. Distance heals. My name is Eugene, and for as long as I can remember, I've lived with my parents in the same house where I grew up. It wasn't a bad place. A 3-bedroom ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood in Ohio. I shared that house with my mom, dad, and my older brother, Austin. Growing up, it always felt like my parents had their own way of doing things, and for some reason, Austin was always the golden boy. Whatever he said or did was gospel to them. If I had an idea or made a decision, it was almost always met with, "Let's see what Austin thinks first," or "Why don't you ask Austin for advice?" But the funny thing was, Austin didn't have to ask anyone for permission. He just did what he wanted. Me? I was constantly reminded to stay in line and keep everything in check, according to their standards, of course. Living under that roof into my 30s wasn't exactly what I had envisioned for myself, but life has a way of stalling you sometimes. I'd managed to land a decent job as an IT specialist, and over the years, I'd been quietly saving up. Every paycheck, I'd put a little away, cutting back on unnecessary expenses and avoiding anything that would put me into debt. I didn't flaunt it or talk about it much because, honestly, I didn't want to hear my parents' opinions on how I should be managing my money. But let me tell you, living at home wasn't always easy. My mom had this habit of barging into my room unannounced. She'd look around, arms crossed, and immediately start critiquing everything. "Eugene, you need to fold your clothes properly. Why is the vacuum cleaner sitting in the corner? You haven't aired this room out in days. And look at these walls. When are you going to change the wallpaper?" It was relentless. Even if I had just cleaned up, she'd find something to comment on. My dad wasn't as vocal, but he had his ways of letting me know when he thought I wasn't living up to their expectations. Austin, on the other hand, could do no wrong. He lived in his own place, had a steady job as an engineer, and, in their eyes, was the perfect son. I always felt like I was living in his shadow. Don't get me wrong. I love my brother, but the constant comparisons and lack of trust in my decision-making wore me down over the years. One day, I was sitting in my room, staring at my computer, and the thought hit me. I needed my own space. Not just a rental or a temporary place, but something that was mine. A house. The idea of coming home to a place where I didn't have to answer to anyone, where I could decorate the walls however I wanted and not worry about someone walking in uninvited, sounded like a dream. I decided then and there that it was time to make it happen. I didn't tell my parents. I knew if I brought it up, they'd have a million opinions, and I'd end up second-guessing myself. Instead, I started researching on my own. I found a realtor online, a woman named Melissa. She was in her late 30s, very professional but also warm and approachable. When I reached out to her, she quickly got back to me and asked about my budget, the type of house I was looking for, and the area I had in mind. I told her I wanted to be far enough from my parents to feel independent, but close enough that I could still visit them without it being a major ordeal. 70 miles felt like the right distance, not too close, not too far. Melissa showed me a few houses over the next couple of weeks. The first one was a little too big for me. A 4-bedroom colonial with a sprawling yard that would have been a nightmare to maintain on my own. The second was a cozy 2-bedroom bungalow, but it needed a lot of work. The third house, though, felt just right. It was a 3-bedroom ranch-style home, not unlike the one I grew up in, but it had been recently renovated. The kitchen had brand new stainless steel appliances. The living room had these large windows that let in a ton of natural light, and the backyard was fenced in with enough space for a small garden or maybe a patio setup. It was in a quiet neighborhood with friendly neighbors, or so Melissa assured me. The price was within my budget, and after sleeping on it for a night, I decided to make an offer. The whole process moved faster than I expected. The offer was accepted, the paperwork was signed, and just like that, I was a homeowner. I kept it all under wraps until everything was finalized. I didn't want my parents interfering or trying to advise me out of it. Once the deal was done, I knew it was time to tell them. I decided to break the news by taking them to see the house. I figured it would be harder for them to criticize my decision when they could see the place in person and realize it wasn't some impulsive mistake. The day I told them, I casually mentioned that I wanted to show them something and suggested we take a little drive. My mom asked 100 questions, as she always does, but I stayed vague on the details. My dad, who isn't much of a talker, just nodded and went along with it. Austin wasn't around that day, which honestly was a relief. As I drove them the 70 miles to my new house, I could feel the tension building in the car. My mom kept asking where we were going, and I could tell she was starting to get suspicious. Finally, when we were about 15 minutes away, I said, "I bought a house and I'm taking you to see it." Silence. My mom's jaw practically hit the floor. My dad turned to look at me like I had just told him I'd decided to move to Mars. The rest of the drive was a mix of stunned silence and my mom's occasional, "You bought a house?" Without telling us. I just kept driving, trying not to let their reactions get to me. This was my decision, and I was proud of it. When we pulled up to my new house, I was in an alarmingly good mood. I was genuinely excited to show my parents what I had accomplished. After all, this was a big step for me, and I'd worked hard to make it happen. I could already picture them walking through the front door, impressed with the clean, modern look of the place and the effort I'd put into choosing something that felt right. But as soon as we stepped inside, I started to notice their expressions. A mix of skepticism and thinly veiled disappointment. I led them into the living room, proudly pointing out the large windows that let in so much natural light. My dad walked across the laminate flooring, stopping halfway to crouch down and run his hand over the surface. "Looks like they didn't lay this properly," he muttered, more to himself than to me. My mom followed close behind, arms crossed, her gaze darting from one corner to another. When we reached the kitchen, she wrinkled her nose at the backsplash. "This doesn't match the countertops at all," she said, shaking her head. I tried to brush off their comments, still determined to keep the mood light. I took them down the hallway to show them the bedrooms, but the criticism only ramped up from there. The bathroom, they decided, was too small and poorly located. The layout of the house was, in their words, simply terrible. My mom started questioning the logic behind every design choice, from the placement of the windows to the size of the closets. It was like they had come with a checklist of things to criticize. Then came the comparisons. "Why didn't you consult us?" my mom asked, her tone sharp. "Or at least ask Austin. You know, his house is so well thought out. He bought with his mind, not emotions, and it shows." My dad chimed in, nodding in agreement. "Austin's place has a much better layout. Everything is perfectly planned there." I've been hearing this kind of thing all my life, but this time, it felt like they were going beyond reasonable. They weren't just criticizing my choices. They were making it sound like I was incapable of making a good decision on my own. I couldn't believe the lengths they were going to in order to tear down what should have been a proud moment for me. I explained to them that I'd worked with a realtor, Melissa, to find the house. She'd been incredibly helpful throughout the process, showing me multiple options and guiding me through the paperwork. But instead of appreciating the effort I'd put into this, they turned their criticism toward her. My mom declared that the realtor must have deceived me, selling me a subpar house just to make a quick sale. She even suggested that Melissa had taken advantage of my inexperience. At that point, I was feeling overwhelmed and honestly hurt. I decided to take my dad outside to show him the backyard, hoping it might distract him from the relentless critique. The yard was one of my favorite parts of the house. A decent-sized space with a sturdy fence and plenty of potential for a garden or patio. As we walked around, I tried to point out what I liked about it, but I could tell he wasn't really listening. He was still stuck on the laminate flooring and the bathroom layout. Meanwhile, I'd left my phone on the kitchen counter. While my dad and I were outside, someone called. My mom naturally decided to answer it. It was Melissa, checking in to see how things were going and if my parents liked the house. Instead of a polite exchange, my mom launched into an attack. She accused Melissa of misleading me, criticized the house from top to bottom, and even threatened to sue for what she called a blatant lie. Melissa, as I later learned, was completely blindsided by the call. She had no idea what she'd walked into. By the time my dad and I came back inside, my mom had finished the call. She looked at me, still fuming, but didn't say much more. We wrapped up the visit and drove back to their house in silence. I could feel the weight of their disapproval hanging in the air, but I was too drained to argue. Back at their house, I started packing for the move. I didn't want to linger any longer than I had to. That evening, Melissa called me again, this time to let me know what had happened. She was understandably upset and confused, and as she explained my mom's behavior, I felt a mix of embarrassment and anger. This wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about boundaries and respect. When I confronted my mom about it at dinner, it turned into a full-blown conflict. She doubled down on her criticisms, insisting that she was only trying to protect me from making a mistake. I tried to explain that this was my decision, my life, and my house, but it felt like talking to a wall. My dad stayed quiet, as usual, and Austin wasn't there to weigh in, which was probably for the best. By the end of the night, I felt more determined than ever to move out and start fresh in my own space. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was taking control of my life, and that, to me, was worth all the criticism in the world. A couple of days after the tense dinner and the confrontation with my mother, I packed up the last of my things and left their house. As I loaded the final box into my car, my mother came out to say goodbye. She stood there, arms crossed, with an expression that was a mix of sadness and frustration. She told me that she wished I'd chosen to live closer to them and that her reaction to my decision was because she wanted me nearby. I didn't know what to say to that. The damage had already been done. Her words hung in the air as I climbed into the car and drove off. The drive to my new house felt longer than usual, probably because my head was swimming with thoughts and memories. I thought about all the years I'd spent under their roof, constantly compared to Austin, constantly criticized, and rarely celebrated. It wasn't that they didn't care about me. It was just that their way of showing it often felt suffocating. And now, for the first time in my life, I was on my own. The thought was both liberating and terrifying. That first night in my house was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It was quiet, so quiet that it felt almost eerie. I sat in the bedroom, surrounded by unpacked boxes, and just listened to the silence. There was no one knocking on the door to remind me to fold my clothes or vacuum the floor. No one barged in to tell me the wallpaper was outdated or that I needed to air out the room. For the first time, the space around me was entirely mine, untouched by anyone else's opinions or adjustments. I leaned back against the wall and let out a deep breath. This was what I had wanted, what I had worked for. A place where I could finally just be. The days passed quickly as I settled into my new routine. The house began to feel more like home with each passing moment. On a whim, I decided to invite my parents, Austin, and his family over for the weekend. Despite everything, they were my family, and I didn't want to shut them out completely. I figured maybe a change of scenery would soften their attitudes or at least give them a chance to see that I was doing fine on my own. When they arrived, the house was instantly filled with noise and commotion. My nieces and nephews ran through the rooms, their laughter echoing off the walls. My dad inspected the backyard while Austin's wife complimented the kitchen, though I could sense she was holding back a more critical opinion. My mom, as expected, couldn't resist pointing out a few things she thought needed improvement. The curtains were too plain, the couch was too small, the dining table wasn't positioned right. And Austin, of course, joined in, subtly mentioning how his house had a better flow and more efficient use of space. As much as I wanted to brush it off, it stung. Standing there, listening to them dissect my choices, I realized something. No matter what I did, it would never be enough for them. They would always find something to criticize, always compare me to Austin. And in that moment, I made a decision. I would keep them in my life, but at a distance. They could visit, they could call, but I wouldn't let their opinions overshadow my own happiness anymore. After the weekend, they packed up and left. The house, which had been so lively just hours earlier, fell silent once again. But this time, the silence didn't feel eerie. Felt peaceful. I stood in the middle of the living room, looking around at the space that was entirely mine. It wasn't perfect, and it probably never would be, but it was mine. And for the first time, that felt like enough. That night, I sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the quiet neighborhood. I thought about everything that had led me to this point. The years of feeling overshadowed, the decision to finally break free, the struggles and criticisms that had followed. It had been a long journey, and it wasn't over yet. But as I sat there, breathing in the cool evening air, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: contentment. For the first time, I wasn't living under anyone else's shadow. I was just Eugene in my own house, living my own life. And that was enough.